Hey, welcome everyone. We are the Northeast Florida chapter of Sisters in Crime, and welcome to our June meeting. This is our first Zoom only meeting, and I'm so thankful and happy to see everybody pouring in to the Zoom call today. I am so excited for our speaker today. I'm so thrilled because she is a working latent print examiner. She's got the goods, and she's exactly the kind of speaker that gets us excited around here. Lisa Black is a New York Times bestselling author of 18 suspense novels, including the Gardiner and Renner series and the Locard Institute series. Her works have been translated into 6 languages, optioned for film, and shortlisted for both the inaugural Sue Grafton Memorial Award and the Nero. She's also a full-time certified latent print examiner and a certified crime scene analyst, beginning her forensics career at the coroner's office in Cleveland, Ohio, and then the police department in Cape Coral, Florida. She's spoken to readers and writers at numerous conferences. She's been a consultant for Court TV and was a guest of honor at 2021 Killer Nashville. Welcome, Lisa.
Okay, first of all, I apologize for still being at work. I had scheduled this, I work every other weekend. I had scheduled this thinking I was going to retire on May 1st, which had been the plan for 2 years, but we're building a house in Tennessee, and then they belatedly informed me I can't quit until the loan converts from a construction to a mortgage loan. Somehow, no matter what, they won't give it to us unless I'm actively employed. So I had to delay my retirement date, which did not make me happy. But so that's why I'm still at work. So I'm really hoping that there's no disaster or anything while I'm here. And okay, let's continue on. Also, ask questions whenever you want. I think it would be a little confusing to try and hold them all till the end. So but I can't see you, so somehow just shout out or whatever, however you want to handle it, to ask questions as they come along. And if I'm going to get to that later, I'll just say I'm going to get to that in a minute, and then we'll hold it. But otherwise, just ask questions whenever you want. I don't stand on formality here. I've been working in forensics for about 30 years now, 25 years here at the Cape Coral Police Department. So let's talk about fingerprints. Fingerprints are my bread and butter. It's probably about 85% of what I do here at the police department, because Cape Coral is a very low crime area, happily. But most of our crimes are burglaries and vehicle burglaries. So even though we will respond to everything from criminal mischief, from a smashed mailbox to a double homicide. But most of what we do is burglaries. So a little history here. Back to the mid-1800s, William Herschel is a British governor in India, and he sees Chinese workers doing this, using their fingerprints as a signature. So he begins this hobby of collecting fingerprints. You got to remember, it's the middle of the 1800s. There wasn't a lot else to do. So meanwhile, another Brit, this Henry Faults, who's a missionary in Japan, gets interested in fingerprints as an anthropological sense. But then one day he has a lab assistant who keeps drinking his lab alcohol, and he uses a feather and some soot to dust the beaker for fingerprints, and figures out which of his associates is stealing the lab alcohol. So the idea of using it as a means of identification in terms of law enforcement is born. So police begin to collect fingerprints around 1891. In 1896, Edward Henry, again, a guy in India with a lot of time on his hands, and it was actually his Indian assistant, but of course, Henry was the Brit, so he gets to name the system after him, develops this Henry system for classifying fingerprints so that you didn't have to look through every single print in your file, because you got to remember, there's no computers. These are basically just pictures. So there's really no way to classify them until Henry came up with this thing, which kind of looked like ancient Greek. It had to do with the ridge count from the delta to the core, and there was 8,000 rules to it, but it did make things easier not easy, easier. It was first used as evidence in a murder case in Argentina when this woman killed her own 2 children because she had a new boyfriend who didn't want a package deal. And she tried to blame it on the handyman. But that didn't go to trial. She confessed and pled. So it was first used in a criminal trial in 1905 when these 2 brothers, Albert and Alfred, robbed a store, and the store owner and his wife lived above in an apartment over the store and wound up murdering him. So they went to trial for that. So the FBI begins compiling fingerprint files. Last statistics I could find online, we've got 72 million criminal prints and 50 million civil around this database. Against this database, they receive and search like 15,000 latent fingerprints each month. And the 4 million 10 prints is applicants, arrestees, people getting concealed carry licenses, whatever that is. It used to be when you were fingerprinted for a job or something like that, they just sent your prints to the FBI and they were checked to see if you had a criminal background. They were checked against the criminal files. And if they weren't, if they didn't find anything, then they were just done. But now with computers and scanners, everything is scanned and kept. They're all in there, but it wasn't all. Yeah. So in all this searching, no 2 people have been found to have the same fingerprint because the fingerprints develop at random in the womb as the baby is moving, and pressure and pH and everything else. Does this mean we've proven that fingerprints are unique? No, because you can't prove a negative. But it seems highly unlikely that you would find 2 people with the exact same fingerprint. Now, fingerprinting basically has not changed since the days of Dragnet. We still just brush on black powder with a brush, and then lift it off with tape and put it on a card, and then we work with that. Latent prints are prints that can't be seen well or can't be seen at all until they're developed with fingerprints, with powders or dyes. Patent prints are prints that are visible because they're in. Prints is smooth, glossy, flat, clean surfaces, polished, glass, marble, porcelain. Clean porcelain is your absolute best because it's always a little cool and it's nice and smooth and non-porous. Clean glass, clean marble, that's your absolute best. It goes downhill from there. You also want like a steady temperature. You want it slightly cool, but not freezing cold. You want low humidity, but not no humidity. What's bad for prints? Obviously a rough surface, upholstery, stone, laminate, like cabinets and things like that. They look smooth, but they're not. If you look at the surface closely, it's actually textured so that it doesn't show prints. So you don't have to clean it all the time is the idea. And high humidity is awful. And of course, we live in Florida. So humidity is always an issue. When you're trying to fingerprint an unair-conditioned house in the middle of summer, I can process the entire house and get nothing at all, even though 4 or 5 people are living there, because the humidity will just kill them. Also, dirt, grease, dust. Behind the TV, on your TV stand, someone steals your TV and you'll see marks, and they're finger marks. They're left there by fingers, but what happens is the person took away dust on their hand instead of leaving prints on the surface. Oxidation, like these outside fences, especially metal, is awful, but even the plastic, which white plastic, you would think it would be a nice smooth surface. It's like I almost never get anything out of there. And you cannot use powder on anything wet. It cannot be wet at all because all it's going to do is smear. It's going to ruin the print. It's going to ruin your brush, and you're not going to get anywhere. Lots of times we've had burglars like to help themselves to whatever's in the fridge, fruit juice, beer, whatever. And I'll get there and there will be a can that they used and it's still got condensation on it. What I do is I dump it down the sink and sometimes take it outside and put it in the sun, and then I'll process the rest of the house, and by the time I come back then it's dry and I can process it. So how we process also depends on the surface. If it's smooth and glossy, like porcelain, glass, that kind of thing, you still can't do better than black powder. That's still the best thing you can use. Paper, cardboard, cellophane, like what you wrap flowers in, like floral arrangements. Magnetic powder, which is just black powder with ground up powdered metal in it. And why that works better on those things, I don't know, but it does. Paper can be processed with ninhydrin and accelerated with heat. Now, we used to do it this old-fashioned way. Ninhydrin is a liquid. We can spray it. You can actually dip whole pieces of paper in it. Just pour it in a pan if you got a lot to do, and just dip the paper in there, totally soak it, hang it up to dry, and then we'll we used to sandwich it in between clean pieces of copy paper and use an iron, just like you see in this picture here. Now we have a fancier oven that we can set with the right humidity and the right temperature and put it in there for 10 minutes and it will accelerate. The thing with ninhydrin is it will keep processing. So eventually this whole piece of paper is going to turn purple. So if you do find prints, then we put a fixative on it, which isn't great because it turns it a pink, so it's actually a lighter color, but it will keep it from processing any further. So usually what I do, if I get a print, I'll photograph it, because you can't lift dyes. You can only lift powder. When something's dyed, there's nothing there to lift. So you can't lift it, you have to photograph it. So I'll photograph it first and then put the fixative on. DFO is the same thing, except it's fluorescent. And ninhydrin is actually, I have a lot more luck with ninhydrin. With wet items, you can process with small particle reagent, is the only thing you can do wet items with. And if we find a gun in a canal, one time some kids stole a golf cart and drove it into a canal, and I used this on it. You have to keep the item in the same water. If you take that gun out of the canal, take a bucket with the canal water and just keep it in there until you get it back here. For one thing, the second you get it, it hits the air, it's going to start to rust. So that's why we always keep it in water until we're ready to do something with it. But don't put it in a bucket of fresh water. And the other thing is this is permanent. So it will not wash off. So don't use it on items that anyone's going to care about. This is why when we have vehicle burglaries and we get there in the morning and the car is covered with dew, there's nothing we can do until the sun comes up and the car dries off. We're not going to use this, or you're going to have fingerprints permanently etched into your paint, which nobody wants. You can also use iodine and something called RTX, which goes through this little atomizer thing here and creates this kind of a light gray response. And you can use that on pretty much anything, but it's a very light color. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. Depends on what the background is. Fingerprints in blood can be dyed with amido black. It's a dye stain. And it will even super faint fingerprints in blood. It will turn this dark purplish black kind of color. And it's really messy, because then once you dye it, you have to rinse it with water, or it'll wash out the background and then you can see the print better. And when you're doing something relatively small, that's easy. But when you're trying to do a wall, like you see in the right-hand photo, which is from an actual crime scene that I worked, they all are actually, these photos. And then you have to rinse. So we're pouring this dye on the wall, and then we're pouring water on to rinse it. So all those paper towels at the bottom is me trying to soak up some of this liquid. And I was giving this talk to a middle school, and one little boy said, "Why don't you just use a spray bottle?" And I'm like, oh, so now we use a spray bottle. And these are also photos of another homicide that I worked. And the amido black, as I said, works really well. You have that rinsing problem, which again, on a flat floor, can also be a problem because the water's got nowhere to go. So you got to do what you can. Sometimes you have to get a little creative with these things. Textured surfaces, plastics, baggies, tools, firearms. We use super glue. We do a lot of super gluing because drug cases, they'll turn us in 40 baggies of little things of drugs that the drugs have to be removed and packaged separately, and then we have to process all these little tiny baggies. Guns, obviously, anything that's rough. Tools, we get a lot of burglary tools, a lot of screwdrivers, and we will process it with super glue. And yes, when I first started here, we had nothing but an old fish tank and a mug warmer that we would put the super glue in the little tray and put it on the mug warmer to heat it up a bit. Now we have this fancy oven that has the hot plate right in it that's set to the proper temperature. We actually use powdered super glue. And then, as you can see, the gun is hanging there to try and get every surface. And this will suck all the air out to create a vacuum inside so that the fuming is nice and even. And that runs for about 20 minutes. Then we'll shut it off and crank the door open and let it sit, usually overnight. You want to give that super glue is going to bond to the amino acids in the print, and it's essentially going to make it plastic. And so you want to let that sit and harden and dry before you do anything more. Now, if it's against a nice, dark, solid background, you don't need to do anything more. If it's against something a little more colored, like a pop can, soda can, then we'll stain the super glue with a dye stain to make it fluorescent, and we can photograph that under ultraviolet light. And then again, as I said, it has to be photographed. So we have this very nice setup system with that we can photograph our fingerprints. We can use ultraviolet light, we can use infrared light, we can use different colored filters to enhance whatever color the dye stain is, and that's how we can get photographs off things that have been superglued. Now, of course, superglue is superglue. So again, it's one of those situations where you don't want to use it on anything that anybody's going to want again, like a cell phone or a laptop, because once you fume it with superglue, it's probably not going to work anymore. So you sometimes want to check with your detective or something about how the victim or suspect feels about that. And as I said, all dye staining, we have to photograph it. You have to use a tripod. You always want to take everything with a ruler. We have little sticky rulers that we can put on our evidence to photograph it, to put it right next to the print. And so stuff to know is criminals still leave prints. You would think with all the CSI shows and everything, now that they'd be smart enough to wear gloves. Nope. For one thing, gloves are hot, especially in Florida. Latex, as we find out here every summer, latex gloves will leave sweat running down your arms. Plus, they don't want to get caught with them. Up north, you can walk around with a pair of cloth gloves if the weather's at all cool, and that's not strange. Down here, it would be a little bit suspicious. And of course, we can still identify with people by their fingerprints. I do it every day. And having to process an unair-conditioned home in the middle of summer can be really uncomfortable. Any questions about any of that? Remember, I can't see you, so you're going to have to shout out.
I think you can go down and raise your hand or just unmute yourself and a question.
Oh, okay. Okay, let's go on.
I have one question.
Okay.
Yeah. What happens with a smudging? You hear in the movies, oh, that's a smudged print. So is there any hope for that or help for it, or maybe half of it's visible? How does that work?
I'll actually be getting to that.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, if it's smudged, you got nothing. You can't fix it. It is what it is. But we will get more into that later. So you basically have three types of patterns. You have a loop where the ridges come in from one side and they go out the same side. Arch where it comes in from one side and goes out the other side. And whorl where it makes a circular type pattern. And that's it. Deltas and cores that I was talking of. A delta is kind of like a delta where there's an island in a river, and the ridges come in and encircle the pattern area, and it forms a triangular little area. And a loop will have one, and a whorl will have two, obviously. Core is the actual center of the pattern area, and this used to be very important back with the old Henry system, because you were classifying prints by ridge count and what exact type of whorl it was. And so all these there was 8,000 rules for what is the exact center of the pattern area and what's the core. And happily, we don't have to hardly ever worry about any of that anymore, because we have computers and they just mark the information and we can just leave it at that. So to compare one print to another, you have to obviously start with a print that has an acceptable quality and quantity of information. And what is information? Is where the ridges divide, it's where the ridges end, it's these little tiny short ridges where we call them dots or islands. Creases, like the creases in the joints, are permanent. And sweat pores, these little kind of whitish things in there that look like bubbles, those are actually sweat pores, and those are permanent as well. Incipient ridges are the little pieces in between the ridges that they aren't large enough or wide enough to be an actual ridge, but they are permanent. Scars, permanent scars can be used. So here we get to your smudging question. The print may not be suitable for comparison. And this is what we see a lot. Probably most of the time, really, that the police turn in. We usually, if we're dusting at a scene and we see this, we won't even bother to lift it because we know. But we tell the officers, turn everything in, because sometimes it's hard to tell without a loop that you can magnify, and at least it shows that you tried. So we always tell the police, just turn in everything, don't worry about it. But like in this example, we can see that there's ridges there. So this is a fingerprint. It was left by a finger, but there isn't going to be enough information in those ridges that are present to be able to actually identify it to another person. So we would just judge this as not of value. And that's it. We're pretty much done right there. And another example here. So if sufficient, we start to note all this information. And how we analyze these, it's like we just start here, that you can go over, there's one ridge in between and there's an ending ridge here, there's one ridge in between, there's an ending ridge here, there's a bifurcation here without anything in between, then there's on the very next ridge, there's not a ridge in between and there's an ending here, etc. So to compare prints, we put them side by side. Now this is a loop and this is a whorl. So obviously they're not the same. We're done right there. Doesn't match. Now, whoops. Okay, these patterns are similar. They're both right slope loops. It looks like a similar distance between the core and the delta on both of them. So we're going to take a little closer look. So you find a starting point. It doesn't matter where, as long as it's the same between both patterns. Okay, we got a little ending ridge here. And you go up to the next ridge and there's an ending ridge there and there's one here. And then you go over one ridge here to this bifurcation. And here there looks, well, over one ridge to this bifurcation. You go up the same ridge to an ending. But on this one, there isn't this, same ridge doesn't end. It's on the next ridge over. And then, you can move over and there's another bifurcation here. So they're similar, but they're not the same. Once we go through all of this. And like on this one, you go over two ridges and there's an ending ridge here. You go over two ridges and there's nothing there. So it's okay. We're done with that one. We're satisfied they're not the same. So these look similar. If we zoom in, and take a closer look. These characteristics are similar. There's bifurcation, bifurcation. In the middle here is an ending ridge. Here, bifurcations, ending ridge here. But these things are different. This is right on the same ridge, continuing up to get this bifurcation. This, it isn't, it's over here. There's a little short ridge right here that isn't here. And there's a bifurcation here that isn't here. There. And there's also a ridge in between this one here and there isn't here. So now we'll compare these two. So all the information, if we start here, we go up to the very next ridge, there's no ridge in between. We go over, there's no ridge in between to bifurcation. We go up, hop over one ridge to an ending, we hop over one ridge again to an ending, go up the same ridge to an ending, hop over one to a bifurcation, hop over two to an ending, hop over one to a bifurcation. This is what I do all day, and it's exactly as exciting and glamorous as it seems. But after this, everything corresponds between the two prints with no significant differences. So at that point, I can say that based on having done this for 25 years and with my judgment and training, that the same person made both these prints. This is another example here. I won't go through it piece by piece, but again, it doesn't matter where you start as long as it's consistent between the two prints. That's what you're looking for. So then we get to step 3, which is evaluation. Okay, now that we've gathered this information about these two prints, what conclusion do we draw? So how many characteristics do we see? Now on the left, it's a decent print. It's not beautiful, but it's decent. On the right, it's really nice. It's nice and clear. You can even see pores. You got lots of information there. Clarity, again, how clear? And again, on the left, it's decent. It's not beautiful, but on the right, again, the ridges are very sharp. The image is very sharp for the most part, and you can see lots of things very clearly. So in rarity, how common are the features? And on the left, it's your basic right slope loop. There's nothing really interesting or exciting about it. It has a definite delta. You've got a delta and a core, but it's all very common kind of stuff. On the right, it's got all these little short ridges inside the circle of the whorl in the middle. It's hard to see in this one, but these make a teardrop shape instead of a circle because they just come down. These ridges come down to this point and just stop. And sometimes that happens. So that's a little different. But there's no set number of points or information in common between two prints that is necessary to determine whether it's an identification or not. Even though so many people will tell you there is. They'll tell you, oh, the FBI requires 8 points, or England requires 12 points or 16. That's not true. England actually had a point standard and then they dropped it. America never had a point standard in this country. And most of the countries in the world do not use a point standard anymore. It's nice, it's handy, it makes everybody's life easier. But there's no scientific basis for it. It's like being pregnant. If you're 4 months pregnant, you're not more pregnant than you were at 2 months. You either are or you aren't. And that's probably not the best analogy, but there's no required number of points. You can actually identify a print to another print with no points, with just ridges and all the other information that I've seen it demonstrated in class. I wouldn't want to do it because defending it in court might get a little difficult, but it is possible. So the important thing to remember, even though people will insist, attorneys will insist that there's got to be a certain number of points, and you're like, no, that's not really true. Some labs will count up the number of points as a quality control measure, but that's just like an internal lab standard so that examiners aren't comparing or trying to search prints that are extremely only have 1 or 2 points. It'd be like doing a Google search with one word that's not unique. You just get so much stuff back that it's useless. There's no point in even doing that. So some labs will count up the points, but it tells you nothing about whether these prints came from the same person or not. So basically, as quantity, clarity, and rarity go up, the probability of observing all this in 2 prints that are not from the same person goes down. So we'll draw one of 3 conclusions usually. And we can say identification, that we determine that this originated from the same source because there's sufficient quality and quantity of corresponding information. We can say it's exclusion, that we were determined to have not originated from the same source because there's enough quality and quantity of information that's in disagreement. Or we can say inconclusive, that we just can't say yes or no, given the information in the print. And why that might happen, as in this example, on the right, down here by the curves, there's a decent looking amount of ridges, and there's where they end, and there's a little short bifurcation here with a short ridge. So there's plenty of information, but in the corresponding area on the left, the print is smudged. And on the left, it's nice and clear right in the center, and you have all this great whorl work that the ridges are curving around. But on the right, the center is smudged again. So even though each print is of acceptable quality on its own, they can't be compared to each other. And this is why you might have the right person in your database, but they don't come up in the search. So, whoops. And then our 4th step is called verification, and which means another examiner checks everything I do, basically. Another qualified latent print examiner. Everything I do, once I've gone through all this, I pass the report off to them, and they go through everything again. They look at all my cards, see if they agree, and they have to initial the back to see if they agree with whether I said it's of value or of no value, or there's no prints on this card, which sometimes happens. Or if, I made an identification, they have to go through the same comparison and look at the prints side by side and see if they agree or not. And then they will sign off on it. Then they send it back to me. I write the report. I send it back to them. They check the report to make sure I didn't have any errors in it. We send it to a third person who does the technical review, what we call a technical review, which is basically just seeing that all the paperwork's in place, that we signed everything and wrote everything correctly in the report. And then she passes it off to the supervisor, who does a supervisory review, and then it becomes the permanent record. But this is basically called ACE-V. Well, no, basically, it is called ACE-V, with the analysis, comparison, evaluation, and verification. And for latent print examiners, that's the methodology that is used in the United States. So in court, though, we can't mention verification. We can't mention that a second examiner looked at it, unless they also want to call that second examiner into court, which they can do, but they usually don't want to save time. Because if we did, that would be bolstering our testimony with the testimony of someone who's not present or testifying in the courtroom. We also can't mention APHIS because people hear that and they assume that means the person had a criminal record, which it doesn't. They don't necessarily have criminal record. Again, everybody goes into it now. So they could be job applicants. They could have gotten a license for something or other. So there's innocent reasons why they could be in APHIS. But conclusion is there's no way to sum this up neatly in words or numbers. You have to actually look at the print. And unlike on TV, we don't have a big banner that comes up that says match on the computer. Computers do not match people. Only people match people. And that's true for DNA or ballistics or anything else. Computers do not decide when something matches. And you can see now why that is, because of all the variations you can have. You're essentially trying to look at two pictures. It's two images. And this is why there isn't a handy set of statistics like with DNA. DNA, it's like there's a certain number of alleles, and they've done all this research to know how many people in this population have this allele and not this allele, and then how many people in this country have this allele or this allele. And they have a set of statistics, and you can multiply all the statistics together, and that's where you get numbers. 1 in 3.5 trillion would be the likelihood of somebody else having this same DNA. But you could actually have two people with the same DNA. And there's only 4 amino acids, and we only have 23 chromosomes unless you have some kind of mutation. So it's possible, it's just astronomical. And fingerprints are the same way, but there's no easy way to demonstrate that. There's no magic number that's going to tell us. So, any questions about that?
You can raise your hand if you go to the react symbol there, the little radio thing beside it. You can raise your hand if you have a question. You want to do that?
No? Okay. Remember, I can't see you, so.
Yeah, no questions so far.
Okay. And now the unhappy part of fingerprint analysis, because we're writing mystery stories, so we all want to know when something goes wrong. In 1997, Shirley McKee, this single 51-year-old woman, was stabbed in her own home. Over 400 latent prints are collected. And they must not get a lot of homicides in Scotland, because I can't imagine taking 400 latent prints, but man, kudos for their thoroughness. So a fingerprint on a Christmas gift tag is identified to this local handyman, although he'd been at the house before. But then a fingerprint on a tin of money at his house is identified as coming from the victim. So they're like, okay, we got these people in both places, but they were known to each other, and he'd been there before, and she was always regifting things. But another fingerprint, but that's not my point. The point is another fingerprint on a door jamb is identified as coming from this policewoman, local policewoman who worked for the police. And the problem is she was never there. She never responded to the crime scene. And at crime scenes, you can get your looky-loos. If it's really interesting, you'll get a lot of cops just stopping by because they want to see what's going on. So they're like, oh, yeah, you were. Just admit it. You'll get a slap on the wrist. It's no big deal. Everybody does it. She's, no, I was not there. And so a few months later, they arrested her for perjury. They had this whole smear trial against her. Nobody can really figure out why this happened. Apparently, nobody had anything against her up until then. But at the same time, Scotland is preparing for the Lockerbie trial regarding the 1988 bombing of Pan Am by 2 Libyans. And a fingerprint was at the basis of that case. So you wonder if they just couldn't have any questions about their ability with fingerprints come up at that time. So all the foreign experts say it didn't match. And eventually testified at her trial 9 years later. And just before it began, they offered her almost £2 million to settle. And she was acquitted, but no explanation for the error was ever given. There had actually been an investigation in 2000 which found cultural collusion and manipulation, but it wasn't even made public in 2006. The handyman also was not apparently guilty either. He was finally released. And they think they found the person, but he was already in prison for murdering another woman. They never prosecuted him for that. And Shirley moved to another town and opened a florist shop. She just totally got out of law enforcement entirely. And she credits her father for saving her life. Her father had also been a sergeant at this same police department, and he And he had retired by then, but he had said, he's just admitted, this happens all the time. It's not a big deal. And she's no. So he finally believed her and started fighting for her. And she said later that he saved her life because she was honestly beginning to doubt her own sanity. Then in South Africa, 2005, a college student is murdered. Her boyfriend left that morning for a class and then was at a business meeting an hour away. So he seemed to have an ironclad alibi. She rents a DVD in the middle of the afternoon, which his fingerprint is found on. But the problem is the latent print, if you look at it, could only have come from a drinking glass, complete with curved edges, curved fingers, and even a lip print on the rim of the glass. He was finally acquitted, and the murder is still unsolved, unfortunately. Then in New York, in 1989, this is really sad case, family of 5 killed, and the house is set on fire. Stolen credit cards lead the police to a Michael Kinge, a known criminal, and who pulls a shotgun on them when they approach and is killed. But his mother admits to using the credit cards, but she's arrested as an accessory to the homicide when her fingerprints are identified on a gas can. And she serves 2 years in prison before anyone finds out that this trooper had met her at a restaurant and then lifted her fingerprint off the drinking glass and then put it on the gasoline can. I don't know if he put it on the can and then lifted it again, or if he just put it on a card and said it came from the can. That little detail, I don't know. And the only reason we know about this is because he interviewed with the CIA. He wanted to work for the CIA. And during questioning, they said, would you ever break the law to serve the interests of your country? And he says, oh yeah, in fact, I've been doing that. And he tells them all about this. And they're like, oh, thanks, next. And they tell the FBI, which for some reason doesn't get around to telling the state police for a year. But then there was an investigation. 5 officers were convicted for falsifying evidence and tampering with evidence. I think the entire unit was disbanded, and the evidence unit, and all new people brought in. And then the granddaddy of them all was the Madrid bombing in Brandon, Mayfield. There was bombing of a train in Spain and killed 192 people, injured over 2,000. And this fingerprint that they found was sent all over the world. The FBI searched it, and they identified Brandon Mayfield. So he had converted to Islam. He married an Egyptian. He was an attorney. He had represented convicted terrorists. So it's like everything they found about this guy, oh yeah, this has got to be him. This has got to be him. And this is the print on the left, is the print from the scene, which is absolutely horrible. I would 100% get that print and say, that's of no value, and pass it on. You got 192 dead people. You want to go the extra mile. But Spain doesn't agree. They're like, I don't think this matches. But the FBI, they arrest Mayfield. On May 19th, they get an independent expert who agrees with it. But on the very same day, Spain's, no, we think it's this guy, this Algerian guy. And 5 days later, the FBI, okay, and they let Mayfield go. And 2 years later, the Office of the Inspector General issues like a 7-chapter report on this error. And why did it happen? Bias, high profile case pressure. And they only looked at the similarities, and they didn't pay any attention to the dissimilarities, and just bias. Questions about that? And that is actually the conclusion of my presentations. Any questions you have?
Lisa, I have a question. This is Laura Jo. I'm curious as to whether fingerprints, if the definition of a fingerprint on a person fades over time. Is it clearer when you're 19 and less clear when you're of a certain age?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. I can tell you that from experience. Yeah, when I demonstrate fingerprints, I want to grab the the teenager in the room if I possibly can. And why? I don't know. Your fingerprints don't change. That's why when the olden like days of John Dillinger, they'd try sanding them off and everything else. They're just going to grow back exactly the same pattern, except for permanent scars, of course, if you get it that deep. But yes, older people, we have terrible prints. And women especially, I swear it's because we clean too much. When we were doing booking here, we do direct booking now and they just go straight to the county. But when we had a live scan and I had to train police officers on the scanner, I would never use my own print because it would just reject. I'd grab one of the young officers and use those, and those would come out. Plus, I volunteer with our local hospice agency, Hope Hospice, and one of the tasks they give me is to volunteer to print new volunteers for their background check. And yeah, it's awful.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else?
I have a question. When I was in college, I had my purse stolen and I went down to the police station to report it and they fingerprinted me, which I thought was odd. It made me feel weird. I'm the victim. Why are you fingerprinting me?
They would consider that elimination prints because they want to eliminate which prints are yours, because of course your prints would be on it. And then they know which prints don't belong to you. Some agencies do that. Again, so if I fingerprint a house, they might take prints of everybody in the house to make sure that they're not wasting their time trying to identify a print that just belongs to the homeowner. My agency, we don't do that here. We take whatever prints we get, we put them in the system. If they match people, that's great. If they don't, then they'll just hang out there forever until they do. We figure it's just not worth the effort of getting elimination prints from everybody. And then of course, there's the whole, now that job applicants and everybody goes into APHIS, it's not really such a thing, but a lot of people like you, that they don't really want their fingerprints in a system. So we'd have to put them in under a different category and then make sure we go back and eliminate them, as they would go in as elimination prints. They'd go into a certain category. So then we could use the computer to compare them, or we could just do it by vision. But then we'd still be responsible for destroying their cards afterwards. And it's just more work than it really needs to be. So we don't do that, but some places will.
Okay. I always wondered that all these years. A long time ago. Yeah. Does anyone else have a question? Well, this has been amazing, Lisa. I learned a lot because you watch CSI on TV and we all know they're not right, but we don't know what the truth is. Okay. Well, thank you to everyone.